Okay, now we are going to cover chapter 4, which is tissues. We are still reviewing from biology. Next chapter, chapter 5, is where we actually start new material. So this should all still be review for you. So we're not going to go into massive details again. But we're going to cover the types of tissues. We're going to cover the types of cell junctions. We're going to specifically talk about each type of tissue. Then we're going to talk about membranes, muscular tissue, nervous tissue, excitable cells, and a little bit about aging. So tissues, remember, are groups of similar cells that function together and carry out specific activities. So they are specialized cells. Histology is the study of tissues, and a pathologist is actually a laboratory physician that aids with diagnoses because they analyze cells and tissues. So the 4 basic types of tissues are epithelial tissue, which covers body surfaces and lines body cavities and also forms glands. Connective tissue has a variety of functions. It supports, protects, binds things together, strengthens body tissues and organs. It kind of acts like a filler in some places, provides immunity and transport, and also helps insulate, store energy, a lot of different functions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Muscle provides movement and generates body heat. And then nervous tissue is really important. That receives, processes, and responds to any kind of stimulus and uses electrical impulses to respond and have our body react accordingly. It activates muscular contractions and also glandular secretions. And the nervous system is pretty much in charge of our body. It regulates everything we do with the endocrine system and helps maintain homeostasis. So the nervous system is extremely important, and nervous tissue is extremely important. So we'll talk about the types of tissues in a minute. First, we're going to talk about cell junctions. So most cells have to be anchored to other cells or structures, and how they do that is by cytoskeletal fibers and transmembrane proteins forming these particular junctions. We have tight junctions, adherens, desmosomes, gap junctions, and hemidesmosomes. This is showing you tight junctions, but we're going to talk about it in a second. Adherens junctions, and again, we're going to talk about that in a second. Desmosomes, which we're going to talk about in a second. Hemidesmosomes, which anchor things to basement membranes. And gap junctions, which are communicating junctions, and we're going to talk about that in a second as well. Okay, so tight junctions. The cells in tight junctions are fused together, so you can think of it as a zipper. If you remember tight, if something is tight, it's really secure, nothing's going to get through, and that's kind of how a tight junction is. It functions to prevent leakage between the cells. It basically allows the fluid to stay within the structure. So the bladder and stomach are going to have tight junctions. A lot of the digestive tract will have tight junctions because if you think about it, the digestive tract has a lot of digestive juices and the stomach is highly acidic, and you do not want that acidity getting out into other organs because if it does, it will actually digest the other organs. So these tight junctions in the stomach prevent that fluid from leaking out. Adherens are like a Velcro belt, so they're adhesive. They basically allow tissues to stretch without fully separating. So if you think of any kind of Velcro that you've seen, how it, zips and unzips kind of, that's an adherens junction. So you have some movement without complete separation. Desmosomes are like spot welds or rivets. So this provides sturdiness, but still giving flexibility. Epithelial surfaces and heart muscles have a lot of desmosomes. So if you think about somewhere where you need some stretch and flexibility, but yet you still need it to be adhered, that would be a desmosome. Gap junctions are channels. These are your communicating junctions. So what they do is they allow molecules to flow and ions to flow between neighboring cells. This allows for a lot of communication and fast communication between cells. So you can coordinate intercellular communication here. Contraction of muscles and rapid nerve conduction are going to have gap junctions. The heart has a lot of gap junctions. So the molecules can flow between the junction, the ions can flow between the gap junction and allow the heart to function as a unit. And then hemidesmosomes, as I said, anchor cells to a basement membrane. So if you compare epithelial with connective tissue, because that's what this chapter mainly focuses on, epithelial tissue has a lot of cells. Connective tissue only has a few. Epithelial tissue does not have a lot of matrix. Connective tissue has a lot. So they're kind of opposite. Epithelial tissue is also avascular, meaning it does not have blood flow. Connective tissue is vascular. So oftentimes when you have an epithelial layer, you'll have a connective tissue layer beneath it that kind of supplies it with blood. For example, your skin. Your skin is epithelial tissue. You do not have any blood flow to the epithelial tissue itself. However, the dermis underneath the top layer is connective tissue, and that has blood flow, so it nourishes the epidermis, which is on top. So if you cut yourself and it doesn't bleed like paper cuts, you're still in the epithelial tissue. But if you cut yourself and it starts to bleed, that means you've gotten down into the dermis and you're in that connective tissue. This chapter mainly focuses on epithelial and connective tissues simply because there's an entire chapter that we're going to talk about with muscle tissue towards the end, and there's an entire chapter on nervous tissue that we're going to talk about towards the end. So looking at the two, what differences can you see? Hopefully you notice that on the epithelial tissue side, it is really tightly packed with a lot of cells. And on the connective tissue side, the cells are kind of scattered all over the place. So since there's a lot of cells on the epithelial tissue, that means there isn't a lot of extracellular matrix, which is just the space between cells. On the connective tissue side, however, since the cells are kind of scattered all over the place, that means there is a lot of extracellular matrix. So we have two main categories of epithelial tissues, or epithelium. We have those that cover surfaces and line the body cavities. And then we have glandular. Glands are cells that secrete substances. We have two types of glands, endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Endocrine glands, again, we have an entire chapter that covers endocrine, the endocrine system. So you will talk about that in AMP2. But the endocrine system, the endocrine glands do not have ducts. So they secrete their products, which are hormones, directly into the bloodstream. Exocrine secrete their products into ducts, onto the surface. So sweat, oil, milk, mucus, things like that are going to be exocrine glands. And if you think about it, comparing endocrine and exocrine, the pancreas is a good example. The pancreas is an endocrine gland as far as secreting hormones, insulin and glucagon, which regulate blood sugar. So those go directly into the bloodstream, and it kind of makes sense because you want to regulate blood sugar, right? Well, the exocrine functions of the pancreas are to secrete digestive juices. And you do not want digestive juices just going all over the place into your body. You want those going specifically to the digestive system. So it makes sense that those go through ducts, specifically to the digestive system. And then as far as the other type of epithelial tissue, which we're going to go into more detail on, the functions of it, protecting, secreting, absorption, it really depends on what type of epithelial tissue it is for what particular function it has. So we'll talk more about that now. Generally speaking, epithelial tissue have a lot of tightly packed cells, very little extracellular fluid. It does have nerve supply, so it does hurt if you cut yourself Even if it's a paper cut, those seem to hurt even more. It has a very high mitotic rate, which means that it divides rapidly. So it has high wear and tear. And again, our skin is the best example there because the top layer of our epidermis is actually dead skin. We're sloughing it off constantly. Every day you slough off dead skin and your skin is replaced. And we'll talk more about that in chapter 5. The epithelium is attached to what's called a basement membrane. Again, it's avascular. It gets its nutrients from the connective tissue layer beneath it. And it can be arranged in single layers, which usually function in secretion and absorption, or multiple layers, which function in protection. So, classifying epithelium, we look at the layers which are above the basement membrane. If it is stratified, meaning there's more than one layer, you classify it by the very top layer of cells. So simple is one layer. These are going to be found in areas that do not really have wear and tear. Functions in diffusion, secretion to get things out, absorption to take things in. These are going to be found in the kidney a lot. Pseudostratified is a single layer attached to the basement membrane, but not all of the cells reach the apical surface, which is the top surface. So what it is it looks like they could be layered, but if you look at the bottom, if you look at the basement membrane, all of the cells are attached. Even though they may not reach the top, they're all attached to the bottom. And then stratified is when there's more than one layer. This often is going to be in areas that are subject to abrasion, like our skin, for example. Our skin is stratified. Also classified by the shapes of the cells. Squamous are flat and irregular shaped, kind of look like fried eggs. Cuboidal are cubes or squares. Columnar are rectangles or columns. And transitional stretches, which means it changes shape. So transitional will start out one shape and then change to another. The bladder is the best example of this. When your bladder is empty, it's kind of flattened. When your bladder fills up, those cells will stretch out. So there you have squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and transitional. So here, putting it all together, we have simple squamous, which is one layer of flat, irregular cells. Simple cuboidal, which is one layer of squares. Simple columnar, which is one layer of rectangles. Stratified squamous, which again, you classify it by that very top layer. So even though it looks like there's other types of cells in there, maybe the bottom looks cuboidal, it doesn't matter. You classify it by that top layer, that's very top. So it's stratified squamous. Stratified cuboidal, oftentimes you're not going to find anything more than 2 layers of stratified cuboidal. Pseudostratified columnar, that's what I was talking about. Not all of those cells reach the apical or top surface, but they all touch the bottom. Transitional, again, changes shape. Other things that are notable, sometimes the columnar will have cilia at the top, and they have goblet cells. Goblet cells secrete mucus. So these are going to be very important in the respiratory tract, digestive tract kind of thing. Some extra information, if the layer is stratified, again, you name it by the cells closest to the free or apical surface, so the top. Some cells on the free surface may be ciliated with columnar or pseudostratified, and some of them, again, have goblet cells interspersed. Columnar and pseudostratified are the types, and those goblet cells are very important because they secrete that mucus to lubricate the area. So take a quick look at these and take a guess at what they are. I'll give you a second. Okay, so A is simple squamous, B is simple cuboidal, C is simple columnar, and that circle is kind of focusing on that goblet cell that's going to secrete mucus. D is ciliated pseudostratified columnar. So you have the cilia on top and you look at those cells and they don't all quite reach the top, but they all touch the bottom. E is stratified cuboidal. Again, 2 layers is about all you're really going to have. And then F is simple columnar. You have that top layer, which is what you name it for. This is just a chart showing you an overview of the epithelial, simple versus stratified, and the functions. So very importantly, make sure you go through this so you know the functions. Sorry. Because the functions are very important and they're going to be on your test. So this is a great chart to study for epithelial tissue. Okay, moving on. Connective tissue. This is the most abundant tissue in the body. Again, it has a lot of different functions. Insulates, strengthens, transports, supports, protects, binds. Generally speaking, it does not have the free surface that epithelial tissue has because it's not really a lining or a covering. It kind of is more of a bulk filler. It does have a nerve supply except for cartilage, and it's highly vascular. Tendons, it's kind of sparse, and cartilage again is avascular, but all the other types of connective tissue are highly vascular. You have a variety of cells that are kind of interspersed throughout the tissue and a lot of extracellular matrix. So there's a large variety of connective tissue. However, all connective tissue have 2 elements. They have the cells and they have the extracellular matrix. So here's just a picture of connective tissue kind of showing you the different variety of cells that are there. The picture is actually in your book. And here's a nice chart showing you the cells versus the extracellular matrix. So the cells, you can have various types of cells. You can have cells that secrete substances to form matrix. You can have phagocytes, which are engulf things, perform general defense. You can secrete antibodies, which are specific defense. Histamines, which are the inflammatory response. You can have fat cells that store triglycerides, cartilage cells, bone cells. So with those different types of cells, you have certain substances, ground substances, and protein fibers. So with phagocytes, you're going to have them between the cells and the fibers. So you'll have kind of different ground substances depending which type of specific connective tissue they're in. You have fluid, semi-fluid, gelatinous, calcified. Antibodies provide the cells with what they need, metabolically speaking, for the ground substance. You're going to have different types of fibers here too. You can have collagen fibers, which anytime you hear collagen, you should think strength. You can have elastic fibers, which anytime you hear elastic, you should think elasticity, as it kind of makes sense. Or you can have reticular fibers. Reticular fibers function more in support. So make sure you kind of look through this chart and become familiar with, cells which are living versus the ground substance, which is non-living. So fibroblasts secrete the matrix, and as I said, they could secrete reticular fibers, collagen, or elastic fibers. Macrophages, as I said, are the phagocytes that engulf things. Plasma cells secrete your antibodies, and we'll talk more about plasma cells in AMP2 when we get to immunity. Mast cells secrete histamine. Mast cells are the equivalent of basophils in the immune system. So basophils, again, immunity, you'll talk about that in AMP2. Adipocytes are your fat cells that store triglycerides. Chondrocytes are your cartilage cells. Chondro means cartilage. So anytime you see or hear chondro, think cartilage. And then osteocytes are your bone cells. And again, osteo, anytime you hear osteo, think bone. And as I said, collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. So we classify connective tissue based on the type of cells present and that extracellular matrix composition. First type is areolar tissue. This is the most widely distributed. We have collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. So all three types of fibers are in this tissue. We have fibroblasts, which secrete the fibers, of course. Macrophages, which are kind of like your cleanup crew. Adipocytes to store fat, and mast cells, which secrete histamine. It's going to help give strength, elasticity, and support. And this is actually found in the dermis of the skin. So the top layer of your skin is your epidermis. The next layer is your dermis, and that's partially made up of areolar tissue. Adipose tissue is, you can kind of think of it as areolar tissue with fat cells. It has adipocytes, which can store triglyceride droplets. It insulates, provides fuel reserve, protects, absorbs shock. It's found around your heart. It's found around a lot of your internal organs. If you've ever seen an autopsy, when they cut the person open, there's usually a lot of yellowish stuff, and that's the adipose tissue. Very importantly, it protects us. As we get older, our adipose tissue starts to deplete, and you do not have that protection you have. So you have a tendency to get colder more often. So elderly people do have validity in when they say that they're cold. Reticular tissue is reticular fibers for the most part and cells. This is a framework for soft organs, and what it really does is it gives other cells a place to kind of hang out. So the lymph nodes, the spleen, the liver, they have a lot of cells that are going to be cleaning the lymph fluid and filtering for us. So reticular tissue kind of gives those cells a place to hang out in a nutshell. Hang on, let me go back. Okay, dense connective tissue proper, we have regular, mostly collagen fibers that are arranged regularly, so it's nice and wavy. This is going to provide strength in two directions. Tendons and ligaments are associated with dense connective tissue, regular. So you can pull your tendons and ligaments basically in two directions. Tendons join muscle to bone, ligaments bone to bone. And you can see it's kind of a wavy pattern. Irregular connective tissue, again, collagen fibers, except they're arranged irregularly. They're kind of all over the place. Kind of looks more like a steak or something. This provides strength in multi-directional pulling forces. So this is in the dermal layer of the skin. So you have the epidermis, and then you have the dermis. The epidermis is epithelial tissue, stratified squamous. Then the dermis is divided into two areas. The top area is areolar tissue. The bottom area is irregular connective tissue. So that's why you can take your skin and you can kind of twist it and pull it all over the place, and it's not going to tear. And then we have elastic tissue. As the name implies, this is mostly elastic fibers. This allows for stretching. It's in the walls of the arteries, the aorta mainly, and again, partially in the dermis of the skin. Now the aorta is the artery that comes directly out of the heart. The blood comes out of the left ventricle and pushes up with a lot of force. So that aorta has to be able to stretch a lot to handle that force. If it doesn't stretch, you can end up with what's called an aneurysm. And if you get an aneurysm, it is very hard to recover from that because the blood is being pumped with such force. It comes out with such force. You bleed out very quickly. And there's a picture of elastic tissue. Cartilage is a specialized connective tissue that we have. It has a very rubbery matrix, and the cells, which are the chondrocytes, are inside of spaces called lacunae. It has chondroitin sulfate for resiliency. Again, avascular, usually doesn't have a nerve supply. But if you've heard of any kind of chondroitin supplements, that is why. It's to help your cartilage, to help your joints. Hyaline cartilage is the first type that we have of the three. It's the most abundant, but yet the weakest cartilage. There are very fine collagen fibers there. They're strong, but yet because they're so fine, it's actually the weakest one we have. The long ends of bones, the nose, the rib ends, and in a fetal skeleton, there's a lot of hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage basically covers the ends of our long bones. We'll talk more about that when we get to the chapter on bones. But what it does is it gives flexibility and support and kind of absorbs shock a little bit. And there's a picture. You can see the chondrocytes inside of the spaces, which are called lacunae. Fibrocartilage is the strongest of the cartilage. The collagen fibers are very thick and they're in bundles. This is found in the pubic symphysis and the intervertebral discs and provides support and rigidity. But, your intervertebral discs can herniate, so the fibrocartilage isn't invincible. It can only take so much, and it has a tendency to weaken over time, which is why older individuals have a tendency to have more injuries. And then elastic cartilage is the last type of cartilage. As the name implies, a lot of elastic fibers. This is found in the external ear, so our pinnae. So you can stretch it, move it around, and it goes right back to its original shape. It provides strength, but you can have some of that elasticity and maintain the shape. Again, you can see the chondrocytes inside of the lacunae spaces. Bone is another specialized connective tissue. It has a solid matrix. It's calcified. The cells are the osteocytes. Again, they're inside of lacunae. We have two types, spongy and compact. It's the hardest tissue in the body. You have mineral deposits, calcium and phosphorus, that give it hardness, and then collagen again gives it strength. It provides support, protection, and storage for certain things like calcium. It's where blood cells are made, and muscles also attach to it. Blood is another specialized connective tissue. It's actually a liquid connective tissue. The matrix is plasma. The cells are white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets. It functions in transport, helps regulate everything, and protects. In the picture over there, the little circles B that are labeled B, those are your red blood cells. The big purple ones labeled C are your white blood cells. And then the tiny little ones you can barely see that are labeled A, those are your platelets. Red blood cells carry oxygen, white blood cells act in immunity, and platelets act in blood clotting. And you will cover that in A&P2 as well. Lymphatic fluid is also a liquid connective tissue. It flows through our lymphatic system, and basically its job is to catch anything that falls out of the blood and put it back in after we filter it. So here's some pictures of connective tissues. I'm going to give you a second to see if you can figure out which all of these are. And I'll take a drink real quick. Okay, hopefully that was enough time. So A is areolar tissue. B is adipose tissue. C is reticular tissue, and you can tell if you look closely because you can see all of the reticular fibers and then all of the cells just kind of hanging out in the fibers. D is dense regular. You can look at it and it's nice and wavy. E is dense irregular. As I said, it kind of looks like a steak or something. Somebody said it reminds them of bacon. F is kind of a tricky one. F is actually elastic tissue. If you look at the little circle highlighted, you can see the dark elastic fibers that are in there. G is hyaline cartilage. H is fibrocartilage. J is bone. And K is blood. So hopefully you got those right. Some other things, mesenchyme is the embryonic connective tissue that's responsible for forming almost all of the other types of connective tissue during embryonic development. Cartilage in a lot of cases is a precursor to bone, especially in fetal development, but also the growth plates and long bones. We will actually talk about that when we get to the chapters on bones. So kind of just put it in your vault somewhere and be able to retrieve it. When cartilage is damaged, though, it's very slow to repair because it's avascular. So a lot of times when people have damaged the cartilage in their knees, let's say, they have to have arthroscopy and kind of shave off the damaged cartilage. Okay, membranes. These are flat sheets of tissue that cover or line the body. We have a few different types. We have epithelial membranes, which is an epithelial layer and a connective tissue layer. These line body cavities that open to the exterior, also secrete mucus by the goblet cells. They have a variety of functions. They can prevent drying by lubricating. They can be a barrier to defense. They can also secrete enzymes. They line body cavities not open to the exterior as well. And they can cover the surface of the body. So like the epidermis of your skin, superficially speaking, and the dermis going down deep. Synovial membranes are with your synovial joints. It's a space between the bones. They do not have epithelium. They do not open to the exterior surface. They're internal. And they have something called synovial fluid inside of them, which actually lubricates the joints. So here's the picture showing you the goblet cells with the epithelium, a serous membrane. Remember serous membranes, the double membrane, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. The skin is a cutaneous membrane. It's a dry membrane. The synovial membrane for your synovial joints with synovial fluid inside to lubricate. And then serous membrane, reviewing it real quick. The pleura are your lungs, the pericardium are your heart, and the peritoneum are your abdominal organs. Serous membranes have two layers, the visceral and the parietal. The visceral covers the organ, the parietal lines the cavity. Fluid between them is serous fluid. So the visceral pleura covers the lungs, the visceral pericardium covers the heart, the visceral peritoneum covers the abdominal organs. The parietal pleura lines the thoracic cavity wall, the parietal pericardium lines the heart cavity wall, and the parietal peritoneum lines the abdominal cavity wall. Muscular tissue is the third type of tissue, again, functions and movement. A lot of cells packed tightly together, very little extracellular fluid, so kind of like epithelial tissue, except muscle tissue is highly vascular. The cells are kind of elongated, or they can be short, and then they go to short and thick when they contract. They have myofilaments, which are the contractile fibers. And as I said, we will cover a whole chapter on muscle tissue towards the end of the semester. This compares three types for you, though: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal is not branched. It's attached to bone. It provides movement, maintains posture, and generates heat. It is striated and voluntary. Cardiac is also striated, but it is involuntary. Forms the mass of the heart and pumps the blood. Very importantly, they have intercalated discs. Intercalated discs have gap junctions, or communicating junctions. So ions can travel from one cell of the heart to the other, and it can function as a unit. Smooth muscle is kind of tapered. Blood vessels, GI tract, bladder, ureter, those kind of things. And basically what it does is it uses peristalsis, which is an alternating, contracting, relaxing motion that squeezes the contents through, kind of like a tube of toothpaste. It's not striated, and it's involuntary. Nervous tissue, again, responding to stimuli using electrical signals. It's going to receive, process, and then respond to the stimuli. It generates action potentials, which are nervous impulses. It's in the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. We have two principal types of cells: neurons, which are your main type that respond to the stimuli and actually conduct the electrical impulses, and then neuroglial cells, which there are 6 of them, that act as little maids and kind of support the neurons. Again, we'll talk about nervous tissue in an entire chapter towards the end of the semester. At the end of the semester, actually. But this is showing you a neuron. The cell body is the larger end that kind of looks like a star. Nucleus is the black dot. The axon is the long part that comes out of the cell body. And the dendrites are the extensions. So dendrites take information in, the cell body processes it, and then sends an impulse down the axon. So dendrites in, cell body processes it, sends the impulse down the axon. So neurons and muscle fibers are excitable cells that generate electrical signals, which are called action potentials. Action potentials are established on the plasma membrane of the muscle fiber and neuron by voltage-gated ion channels. So when they're excited, neurons stimulate other neurons, or they'll stimulate muscles to contract, or glands to release whatever they have. Muscle fibers contract and result in movement. So we're going to talk about action potentials when we get to those chapters in detail. Trust me. So you guys are responsible for tissue repair, aging, and tissues and disorders and medical terminology. But like last chapter, I kind of want to say a few things here. As far as tissue repair goes, epithelial tissue has a really good rate of repair. It can repair itself pretty rapidly and pretty well. Connective tissue depends on the type of connective tissue. Some have limited repair capabilities, other types are not very good at all. Muscle tissue is relatively poor at repairing itself, and nervous tissue is the worst. Nervous tissue does not have very good repair capabilities. There is a difference between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, which is your brain, spinal cord, no repair capability whatsoever. So if you get an injury in your spinal cord, wherever the injury is, from that part down, you're going to be paralyzed. Peripheral nervous tissue, however, does have some regenerative capabilities. So let's say you cut off your pinky and they save it and reattach it. It will regenerate to an extent and you will get movement back. It's not going to be the same pinky you had before, but it does have some reparative capabilities. As we talk about repair, some things are important. Nutrition, of course, is important. Repair takes a lot on your body, so you need to be well nourished with proteins and vitamins to help this repair along. Circulation also matters. You have to have good circulation because you need to get everything where it needs to go to do the repairs. You need to be able to get the nutrients and everything it needs to repair itself to the injury site. And then aging has a part in it too. When you age, everything kind of starts to deteriorate. Your bone density goes down, your adipose tissue layer decreases, you get wrinkles, you lose your elasticity, your muscle strength goes down, everything starts to go down. So the point is that as you age, you're not going to be able to repair yourself as easily as if you were young. Younger individuals have faster repair and better repair. Older individuals could also, break things a lot easier. They're more fragile. So a lot of problems come with aging, unfortunately. The major connective tissue disorder are autoimmune disorders. Autoimmune disorders are when your own immune system attacks your body. And one of these is systemic lupus. Now, systemic lupus, again, your immune system attacks your body, causes a lot of joint pain. Part of the thing with lupus is it can be mild or it can be severe to the point that it can actually kill you. One of the trademarks is the butterfly rash on your face that you can get. But again, it completely depends on the person. So read the little box that's on page 138 in your book and kind of be familiar with lupus. We're actually going to talk about lupus again in AMP2 when you get to immunity because you're going to talk about autoimmune disorders. So kind of familiarize yourself with it a little bit now and save yourself the trouble later in a nutshell. Okay, so that is it. If you have any questions, as always, send me a message.